Hello, welcome to this video where I will show you how to make API requests with JavaScript. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a file. We'll just do an index.html. We'll create a basic HTML file, and we're going to call this app Random Dogs. And for this app, we are going to use Bulma, which is a CSS framework. So I'm on the Bulma website, and I am just going to grab the CSS. Let's see, here it is. And actually, I want to add that link at the bottom of the head. And then we need like a basic layout. So first, let's look at components. I want like a Navbar. So let's grab a Navbar. Something very simple like this should do. Let me put that right there. I don't want that menu on the side. I don't want an image. I'm just going to have a nice little dog emoji. That one, like that. And it's just going to link to the page itself. Cool. So in this directory, I'm going to start up light server, which is just a static file server that automatically refreshes when things change. So we can see that I have the navbar. It's not a different color though, so I can't really see it. Let's see if there are other colors that I can use. Oh, here we go. Yeah, I want like this dark one. I think I can actually just do navbar is dark. Let's see what we get. Hey, we have a navbar. Cool. And so what I want also is just a little section on the page that will say, welcome to Random Dogs. Click this button to view Random Dogs. So let's see. Do we have like a Jumbotron or something like that? Layout hero. I think that's the one I want. Yeah, something like this. And we'll do it. I like this color. So I'm just going to grab that section. That's going to go right below the nav. I'm going to create a main section that will have that. And it's going to say Random Dogs. Welcome to Random Dogs. Click go to see some random dogs. All right, let's see what we got. Not bad. So now I want a button that just says go that the user can click on. So let's go over here. Let's go to components. Let's grab a button. Maybe it's under elements. Button. Yeah, I want a button. I want a nice big button. Yeah, look at that large button. Yeah, I guess I don't want it to be full width though. Well, I'll just copy that button. And then below this section, I probably want like a div. I'm going to add that button. We'll say go. And then I can add a class to it to give it a color. Let's give it the success. So is success, which will make it green. So that should give me a button. It's all the way on the left. I want to center it, and I want to give it a little bit of margin on top. I believe there are like helpers? Responsive helpers? I'm curious. So I know with Bootstrap I can do something like margin top 2. Can I do that with Bulma? I cannot. Let's see. Layout. This is a quick project, right? Yeah. So after I get this layout, it's going to be totally fine. It's going to be great. Okay, I don't know exactly how that's going to work, so I'm just going to create my own custom class. So I'm just going to call this button section. And then up at the top here, below where I brought in that CDN, I'm going to add a style tag, and we're just going to style that button section. And I'm going to say margin top is 2 rems, and text align is center. And let's see what we get. There we go. So I want to click this button. I want to get some random dogs, and then I want to see them on the page. So We have set up the client. Very good. Now we need to make an API request with JavaScript. So for this, we're going to be using the dog API. You can find it at dog.ceo/dog-API. And they have a lot of different endpoints. And so each of these different endpoints allow us to get different data about dogs. So they have an endpoint called list all breeds. And if we make a request to this endpoint, we're going to get back this data. You can see it's JSON data, JavaScript object notation, which gives us a bunch of different dog breeds. They also have an endpoint where I can get a random dog image, and you can see that that has a URL. And they also have an endpoint where I can get a number of random dog images, and this is the one that I'm going to use. So basically, I can use JavaScript to request the data from this URL, and then once I get the data back, I can then use that in my page. And just as an example, because all of these endpoints work off of GET requests, I can actually test them in my browser. So if I take that URL and just paste it in and hit enter, that sends a GET request to this dog API server, and then I get back the response. And we can see that the response has a message property with an array with multiple images, and I can now potentially use that in my application. So I'm going to make a request to this very URL. So here's what we'll do. We'll create a new file. We'll call it app.js. I'm going to create a variable called API URL, and I'm going to put that URL inside of there. Cool. Now let's make the request with JavaScript. So for this, I'm actually going to create a function called like get random dogs. So let's create a function, get random dogs. And inside of this function is where I'll actually make a request to get the random dogs. Let's take a quick stretch. That's my break timer. And now we can make the request. So for this request, I'm going to use something called fetch. Now, fetch is built into all modern web browsers, and it allows us to make API requests with JavaScript. So here's what I'll do. I'm just going to say fetch, and I'm going to pass in that API URL. So it's going to make, by default, a GET request to that URL. And then I want to do something with the response. So API requests are known as, or are asynchronous, meaning they don't complete immediately, right? They take some time. And you can see that if I open a new tab, paste this in, and hit enter, it doesn't come back immediately. It takes a few seconds, right? It has to go through the tubes of the internet, get that data, and then bring it back to me, so it takes some time. So to help with that, in JavaScript, we can use this thing called Async Await. So I'm going to set this function as an async function, and then I'm going to await, or wait on the response. And I want to store that response in a variable. So I'll say response equals await fetch against that URL, and then now that I've gotten the response, I know that this API returns JSON data. So I need to actually parse the response as JSON. So for that, I can say JSON equals await response.json. Now, similar to making the API request, so making the API request is an asynchronous thing. It returns a promise, which is why we have to await it. And parsing it as JSON is also an asynchronous thing. It returns a promise, so we have to await it. But now that I've awaited those two things, I should be able to log the JSON, and we should see that data in our console. So now that I have this file, let's go to our index.html. I'm going to add a script tag down here at the bottom. We'll say source equals app.js. And now nothing will happen because I haven't called my function. So just to see it happening, when the page loads, we'll call this function. It should make an API request, get back the data, and then log it to the console. So let's see what happens. I'll open up the DevTools, and there's an object there. And if I look at it, it has a message property, and that has dogs in it, and it has a status of success. So we have successfully made that API request, and it now lives inside of our JavaScript, and we can do something with it, which is great. Great. All right, let's keep going. So if we look at our checklist, we made the API request with JavaScript. Easy enough. But now, how do we actually get to that data? So we can see when we log it in the console, I'll refresh, we log it in the console, this is an object, and it has a message property, right? And I want to get access to that message property. So because this is an object, I can use dot notation. So in my JavaScript, if I were to log json.message, Now I get just the array. So because the API returned an object that has properties on it, I can access those properties. And in this particular case, it had a message property. So I could say .message. When you're talking to APIs, they may have other properties. And basically, you'll have to use those properties to get at the data. So now, JSON.message is an array of images. And that's what I actually want to add to the page. Very good. So in our objectives, determine how to get the data from the response. We've done that. We logged it to the console. We looked at the properties. We figured out that the message property is the one that we want. Now we can add the data to the page. So here's what I want to do actually, just really quick before I use JavaScript to add it all to the page. I'm going to add it manually just so I can figure out what HTML I need, and then I'll know what HTML I need to generate when I need to add it to the page. So there's a dog image. Let's figure out in Bulma how we're actually going to show this on the page. Let's look at components. Maybe we want like a card. Yeah, I think we'll use like a card with an image on it. Let's do this. So in my HTML, below the button, I'm going to create a div that has a class of random dogs. And for now, I am actually going to write the HTML that does it, but then we're going to do it dynamically based on the response. So let's grab this div class card. We're going to put that right there. And let's see what we get. Cool, so we get one really big card. I kind of want it to be 3 columns, so let's look at their layout. We can do layout. And actually, what is a media object? That might be what we want. That's not what we want. Columns, basics. I think this is what we want. We want to basically create a layout that has 3 columns because we're going to have 3 random dogs. So I'm going to do something like this. So inside of my div class random dogs, I'm going to have a bunch of columns. Let's see what that does for us. Cool, that works. So now instead of having like first, second, third column, I'm actually going to have this card inside of that column. So let me take this card. And then let's just make that the first column. And then I only want 3 columns, so let's get rid of that 4th column. Let's see what we get. We should see, yeah, there's 1 column, 2 column, 3 column. So this is kind of getting what we want. Now, if I look back at this card that we copied, we don't really have any content. So I'm just going to delete the content. And we really just have an image. So let's see what that does. Yeah, I think that's all we want. So basically, we're going to have 3 of these. Div class column, div class column, and div class column. And that gives us 3 columns, but now we're actually going to dynamically add them to the page and actually set their image to be the image that we got back from the API. So let me get rid of all those. So basically, this div class column is the thing that I want to recreate and add dynamically to the page. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give this parent container called random dogs. It now has the class columns. And what I'm going to do dynamically with JavaScript is once I get that data back from the API, we're dynamically going to add 1 column, 2 column, 3 column by iterating over that array. So we're going to do that all dynamically. Here we go. So, but right now we have a totally empty div, has a class of columns. So first thing I need is I need to get a reference to this div so that I can append things to it. So let's do that in my JavaScript. Up at the top, I'm going to create a variable called random dogs element. And we'll say element equals document.query selector. And we'll say the thing with the class random dogs. So this line of code here will get a reference to this element called random dogs, and it stores it in a variable, so now we can append things to that variable. And if you remember, JSON.message is an array, right? It's an array of 3 things. So we will essentially need to iterate over this array and add a new column to each one. So really, that HTML code that I copied is kind of what we want to recreate, but we need to do that with JavaScript. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to say json.message.forEach. Now, because message is an array, we can use forEach to iterate over it. And we'll say for each dog image, we want to do something with it. And essentially what we want to do is we want to recreate this element using JavaScript and then append it to the page. So let's start at the top. Let's create an element called column element. And that's going to be document.create element. We want a div, and then that div needs to have the class column. So we'll say column element dot class list dot add column. All right, good so far. Now inside of that, we want to have a div with the class card. So we'll say card element equals document dot create element, and we want to create a div, and then we want to say card element dot class list dot add card. So we're going to add the card class. So at this point, we're here. Now that we've created the card, we actually want to append that card to the column element so that the card is inside of the column element. So we're going to say column element dot append child card element. There we go. Now we need to create that div with the class card image. So we'll say const card image element equals document.create element. We want to create a div, and that div has a class of card image. I still love you, Boyan. I'm just trying to get this done. Okay, so we need to set the card image class name. So we'll say card image element class list dot add. We want to add the card image class. Cool. Now we want to take this element that we created and append it to the card element. So here we'll say card element dot append child card image element. Okay, we're almost there. We're very, very close. At this point, we have recreated this structure, right? Now we need to create the figure element. So we'll say figure element, and that's going to be document.create element. We want to create a figure. We're going to add two classes to it. So we'll say figure element dot class list dot add image. And we also want to add the is 4x3 class. So we'll say figure element dot class list dot add is 4x3. Yeah, and so there's a question from Andrew. Is that figure actually necessary? I think it has to do with the layout of the card and this like is 4x3 class. Though actually, I think that's going to change the it could change the aspect ratio. I'm actually going to leave off the is 4x3. I'm going to do that. And then we take that figure element and we need to append it to the card image. So we'll say we'll say card image element dot append child figure element. Okay, so we're here, and finally we can create the image. So we'll say const image element, and that's going to be document.create element image. And this image element, we need to set the source attribute. So we'll say image element dot src equals, and here we can just say dog image, because json.message is an array of image URLs. Dog image is going to be an image URL, and this is where we want to set the source of that image. Now we can say image element needs to be appended to the figure. So we'll say figure element dot append child image element, like so. And then lastly, we need to take this column element here and append it to the random dogs element. So we've recreated this structure using JavaScript, and now we'll say random dogs element dot append child card element, or sorry, is it column element? Because we want to append this entire structure that we just created. So we're going to append the column element. And if I've done everything correctly, when the page loads, we get 3 random dogs. Great. One thing I wanted though is I don't want those images to show up until we click the go button. So what I'll do is I'll add an event listener to this button. So when we click it, then we make the request. So instead of calling this function when the page loads, we need to get a reference to that button, which is right here. Let's give it a class of go button. And now that we've given it a class of go button, we can then reference it in our JavaScript. So I'm going to say go button is document.query selector, the element with the class go button. And then I want to listen for when the user clicks on that button. So down here, I'm going to say go button.add event listener. I want to listen for the click event. And when it's clicked, I want to call the get random dogs function. So I can just take this function name, pass it right here. And now, when the page loads, we shouldn't see anything. But if I click this button, we should get 3 random dogs. And if I click it again, we get more random dogs. And if I click it again, we get even more random dogs. So one thing I need to do is every time I call this function, I need to clear all of the previous results. So that way they're totally replaced. So here's what I'll do. Whenever we call get random dogs, I'm just going to say random dogs element dot inner HTML equals nothing. So we're just going to blank it out. So that way when we add the 3 new dogs, they'll be the only things on the page. Now let's take a quick stretch. I'll answer a few questions in the chat, and then I think we're done with this example. So, refresh the page, click go. 3 random dogs, click go. It empties out, then we see 3 random dogs. Click go. There we go. Random dogs all day long. Very good. Okay, so you can see here that we have basically recreated this DOM structure using variables in JavaScript. And it's a lot of code, but one thing I'll show is you can actually do this with a lot less code, but there are some implications, but let me show that. So basically, I could comment out all of this code that I wrote, and instead, let's say we just want to append some HTML to the random dogs element. So I could say random dogs element dot inner HTML plus equals a template string, and then I can put my HTML string inside of there. And then the thing I need to change is this URL right here. So I need to change this to be a dog image. And we'll get rid of that is4by3 class. We'll get rid of this comment here. And this will actually work in exactly the same way. So basically what we do is we iterate over the array of images. And then for each image, we add some HTML to that dogs element, which is that HTML there. And this should work. So if we go back to the browser, where are we? So if we go back to the browser and click go, it still works, but with a lot less code. But one thing I'll mention is if you're doing this, you potentially open yourself up to cross-site scripting, which is where you potentially might inject scripts into the page. So if you're talking to an API that you trust and you know you're not going to get bad data back from, you could probably do this. But the issue is, what if dog image was like a script tag or something malicious, and you're just adding the HTML to the page? That would not be a good thing. Whereas when we manually created each element, there isn't really a way for that code to run. So that's one way to do it. One last thing I'm going to do is basically show a loading spinner when you've made the request, and then hide the loading spinner when the request is done. So if we take a look at Bootstrap, and let's go to Elements, Progress Bar, sorry, not Bootstrap, Bulma. If we take a look at Bulma, we want an Indeterminate Progress Bar. Let's try this one. Let's just see what it looks like. I'm going to add it to the HTML. Let's put it right about here. Wait, is that the right one? Oh, okay, yeah. So 60% because it's about that width. All right, so if we go here, there it is. Cool. I want there to be a little bit of room. So I'm just going to, again, create a new class. Let's just call this MT2. This will have a margin top of 2 rims. And then let's put this, actually, let's just give it an overall margin of 2 rim. And then we're going to put this progress bar in a div, so it has a little bit of space around it. So we'll have a div. We're going to put that progress bar in there, and then we'll give it a class of, what did we call it? Let's just call it margin. So we'll give it a class of margin. We'll save it. And there we go. There's a little bit of breathing room. Cool. So what we want to do is when the page loads, we actually want to hide this loading spinner, and we only want to show it when we're actually making the API request. So in my JavaScript, I'll create a variable to hold the loading spinner. Loading element. We'll say document.querySelector, the thing with the class loading. And now that I thought of it, loading is a much better name for that class we created. So let's do that. Let's call this loading. And then we're going to call this element loading. So now this element has the loading class, and we've stored it in a variable. And when the page loads, we're just going to hide it. So when the page loads, we'll say loading element.style.display equals none. And by default, it should be gone. Cool. But when we make the request, we initially want to show it, so we're going to remove that. And then when the request is done, we're going to hide it again. So now, when I click go, we should see a spinner. And then we see some dogs. The spinner isn't there for very long. Try it again. It's not there for long enough. One thing technically I could do is like set a timeout before I hide it. That's okay. Basically, my internet is too fast and we're not seeing that loading spinner. I could slow my internet down though. Let's try that. So over here on my network tab, I can actually set this to like 3G speeds. And now it should be a little bit slower. So if I click go, we see it for a second, and then we see the images load. Very cool. So that's it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching. Ultimately, we set up a client app, we made an API request, we added that data to the page, we showed a loading spinner, and we allowed the user to actually load data multiple times. So thanks for watching.